from the Renew project in Exeter, which is a very exciting opportunity. And I think I'm going to, oh, there we go. So Angela and Eleanor from Renew, you're going to share your experiences with us at interdisciplinary working. So I'll just hand over to you.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Hi, everyone. So I should say we've got quite a lot to gallop through. So basically, come and grab us afterwards if you didn't catch something, because we've got a lot of ground to cover. So we're going to be talking today about the Renew project, which is a very large NERC-funded project, which is also going on at the university, is interdisciplinary and involves a lot of different kinds of social science and humanities work. So just to briefly, very briefly, I could spend all day explaining exactly what goes on in Renew. There's a lot. But Renew is funded by NERC. Very importantly, there are 3 co-leads, a natural scientist, ecologist, political theorist, and the head of research at the National Trust. So we have NGOs, social science and natural science right at the top. We have 4 topical themes, thinking about renewing biodiversity, and I should say the full title is Renewing Biodiversity Through a People in Nature Approach, but that's a bit of a mouthful. So we have 4 topical themes and 3 cross-cutting themes, one of which, the first one is around computing and data and AI. The second one is called X Cases, who are doing kind of short-term policy-focused projects. And the third one is collaboration in practice, which is the theme that Eleanor and I work on. We also have an enormous amount of partners in the way of these things. But to give you some idea, this is kind of what we actually look like when we're doing stuff together. Another way of thinking about Renew, as you can imagine, our project meetings do feel a bit like that meme about the Zoom meeting in the Muppet Show. There's a lot of us. I think these numbers are actually not correct. We've got bigger since then. It's very difficult to keep track. One of the things to also flag is that if you look closely at who's on the project, at least half, and I think possibly more than half of us are social science and humanities researchers. It's actually, again, kind of hard to count because there's lots of people who are kind of a bit of this and a bit of that. But those are kind of 2 kind of headline things to flag about Renew. So it's huge. It's the biggest project I've ever worked on. For some people in the project, it's actually not that unusually large. And again, that tells you something about different disciplinary ways of working. So to tell you a bit more about what our theme is doing in Renew. So our theme is called Collaboration in Practice. And effectively what we're interested in is how people work together across disciplines. And we're interested in studying that within Renew itself, and we're doing that via embedded STS methods, so ethnography and interviewing and diary work. And we also have a very active collaboration with National Life Stories, the British Library Oral History section, working with historians who are taking oral histories of people who are mid-career, the end of their career, who have done this kind of collaborative work, so either working across disciplines or with policy or in communities or some of the early citizen science projects as well. We've been really fortunate in being able to talk to people like that as well. So we have kind of a very active interdisciplinary collaboration going on within our theme. And just to say exactly who we are, I forgot. So there's myself, there's Eleanor Hadley-Kershaw, Susan Molyneux-Hodgson, our PhD student Rebecca Edgerly, Carolyn Merchant, who's also working with us, and then at the British Library.
Carolyn Peterson.
Sorry. Why did that come out wrong? Sorry, Carolyn Peterson. Sorry, Carolyn. Really apologise. Paul Merchant and Mary Stewart, who are at the British Library. So that's our little bit. So even our little bit of Renew is not small. And that kind of gives you some idea. So all those other parts of all the other themes I think all the other things are even bigger than us.
Yeah.
So it's a huge amount of people. And so this is what we're about. Okay, so just briefly, a couple of thoughts about interdisciplinarity. What I'm not going to do is go through the definitions of what's cross-disciplinary and what's interdisciplinary and what's transdisciplinary. Partly because while they're helpful, it's been rehearsed a lot, and also there are some problems. So if you look at a lot of the images that are used, there's a very sort of normative idea that the ultimate goal should be this kind of transdisciplinary nirvana where there are no disciplines and everything happens all at once. One of the reasons why we like this diagram is because at least it's circular. But it also, a lot of these things assume that disciplines are bounded things in the first place, which they're not. And it also doesn't really deal terribly well with co-production and working beyond academia. It kind of folds that in and assumes that's just like working with another discipline, and it's not really. So watch this space. We are thinking about how to better represent these ideas. You'll notice that we kind of had an elephant on our front side, and the elephant's kind of a theme and a mascot for our work. So partly this very old story about the blind man and the elephant, which is problematic in some ways, but is also quite productive and interesting. So in this, often the assumption is that everybody's working and looking at the same thing. They think it's different. In this one, actually, somebody might be looking at something completely different. If you start thinking about ontologies, there may be people involved in the project who don't think there's an elephant there in the first place. So there's also important issues around the elephant in the room, which we'll come back to later. And of course, elephants never forget. One of the other things we're very interested in, which I'll talk a bit more about, is thinking about this in the long term, thinking about the history of interdisciplinarity. So what we're working on is away from that normative model towards thinking about different kinds of interdisciplinarity, different modes of working, different kinds of scholarly identities, and how they might be appropriate in different times and places. So, for example, some of the people we've talked to, and this is across oral history and social science, are deep disciplinary experts who are really interested in what happens when you spark one discipline against another. There are people who often talk or think about themselves as diplomats, who are kind of spanning across boundary spanners, people like that. There are people who talk about themselves as magpies, and I should explain this image on the top left is my very favourite interdisciplinary research story from the last few years, which is a project which is a collaboration between ecologists, museum professionals and artists about birds who make their nests out of anti-bird spikes. Look it up, it's a glorious story, and I think the very best bit is the way that the researcher's hair matches the nest. It's fabulous, but this idea of magpieing is something that a lot of people talk about. Others talk about themselves as undisciplined scholars, and that's increasingly a thing that's getting voiced, but it takes a bit of bravery to talk about that. Mm-hmm. And many of us are kind of like the cat in the hat. We're kind of balancing all these different things all the time. The one image that's not there that should have been there is, of course, we all follow the money, frankly, and that there is been and has been funding there to do this kind of work is super important, and we shouldn't ignore it. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical side of this work. So this is via the oral histories, but this is also our research questions in the first place, is that while we're familiar with interdisciplinary discourse, and we may have come across these ideas sort of say through the last 10, 20, 30 years, what we've learned is that actually it goes back a lot further, and particularly around environmental research. So you have the case of the Man in the Biosphere programme, which still exists, but primarily in terms of biosphere reserves. But originally, the original vision was for an interdisciplinary, problem-oriented research programme. And so if you look at some of the things that people wrote, so this is one of the main directors of Man in the Biosphere. I'm not going to read out these quotes, but if you read this, this could have been written yesterday. And so there's a really important question here, is that if we've known about some of these issues, about shared research questions, about hierarchies of evidence, that social science needs to not be an add-on, so on and so forth, why do we keep reinventing the wheel? And what we can see is, if we go back, that we have been reinventing the wheel at least since the 60s, and probably earlier. Certainly since the dawn of environmental science as we understand it now. So there's this question of why have these calls and challenges persisted? And so thinking about Renew, thinking about research and placing it into these longer term institutional and science policy contexts is super important. And this does continue into the 21st century. Projects and programs like Access and Renew are not the first time this has been done, even within this century. So there have actually been a series of multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary research councils, research programs, some of which have been funded by one council, many of them by several. Many people in this room have been involved with. And so we're really interested in what's happening there at the Research Council level. And also, when a programme finishes, where does that knowledge go? And particularly, where does the experiential learning go? And so, again, we're tracking that through our interviews and the oral histories, and beginning to see evidence that that tacit learning is happening, even if it's not being formally articulated. So we're really interested in that, and we're also interested in thinking about not just Renew, but Renew is one of 4 equally huge multidisciplinary projects funded within a programme called Changing the Environment. Again, from the science policy point of view, this is particularly interesting because all of this activity is being funded by NERC, who have not traditionally funded. They've had a very bounded idea about environmental science. And so we're really interested in what's happening there. Is this a temporary space of experimentation? Or if you look beyond the research councils and think about what's happening across environmental science, is it to do with environmental science increasingly understanding that people are part of the environment, so we need to understand people and we need to therefore change how we're defining these fields? Don't know. Watch this space. Okay, at that point, I'm going to pass over to Eleanor as lead author on our practice guide, and we'll continue.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Angela. Sorry, I can't see around these high monitors. This practice guide is something that was written into the design of the collaboration in practice theme of Renew. And the idea is to draw on existing grey literature on collaboration across disciplines and across sectors, the academic literature on that space, and then also our experience within the collaboration in practice team, which kind of adds up to many years of experience in interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary working to create this living guide to fostering collaborative practices in Renew, but also beyond Renew. And the idea of this document is that it's a living resource for Renew members and partners and others to make use of and feed into. And so we're kind of going to do several iterations of this. The first iteration came out in March 2023. Since then, we've run a series of events and kind of been in touch with partners and the wider project to get input to think about the next iteration. And we've also been drawing on the research that we've been conducting, so the oral history research and also the social science research and our kind of broader interactions with the Changing Environment programme to feed into the next iteration, which is going to come out soon. Watch this space any minute now. And in the long term, we're thinking about another manifesto for collaborative practice. And it was really interesting in some of our partner meetings when we said that that's what we were planning, they were quite nervous about that terminology. So that might be something that we revisit, but it's also, you know, something that's been used in the past in relation to sort of thinking about collaborative ways of working. So that's what the first iteration looked like. The next iteration will look slightly different. So I don't have enough time to go into any kind of detail in terms of the content of the document, but just really want to stress that we focus on practices, so whether that's methods, organisation, habits, the kind of everyday ways that we enact our collaboration, and the importance of social cohesion and care in those practices. So caring for each other, caring for the subjects and objects of our work, and caring for the practices themselves, so really paying attention to what we're doing and how we're doing it. Yeah, it's a bit of a cliche now, but the significance of taking time for this kind of work, and it really does take time, but also taking risks and experimenting. And then the significance of mutual support at scale. And we think, you know, there's a huge amount of learning to be had in the context of access and similar initiatives, which are really ideally placed to foster these kinds of interdisciplinary practices, given that they're kind of not bounded in the ways that a standard project might be. So in terms of kind of reflecting on our work to date and next steps, so interdisciplinarity in general, but particularly environmental interdisciplinarity, is really kind of dealing with issues and dilemmas of scale. So we're thinking about huge environmental challenges, and a lot of these projects are really huge. But we know from the literature and from experience that collaborative practices tend to be better fostered by working in smaller groups. So how do we kind of scale or bridge these different scales? There's also the kind of fact that since the pandemic we've tended to shifted to more online working, and that's great. It can be much more kind of inclusive. It enables collaboration across kind of, you know, geographically dispersed partners, etc., but it risks neglecting the need to hang out and spend time together. So, you know, we know that spending time together in person kind of creates the social and effective glue that allows kind of productive collaboration to happen, or, you know, enjoyable collaboration to happen. And again, time. So interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity really do require time to build new practices, but also to kind of think about applying experiential learning, generating experiential learning, as Angela was talking about earlier. But this is really counter to these imperatives for the short-term applied and quite precarious research that seem to become more and more common. And Angela has coined the fabulous term agilization to think about this. Yeah, definitely, it's great. So I think it's really important, and we've been seeing in our work the need to think about formal and informal mechanisms to iterate, so to pass kind of from one iteration to the next. And it's really interesting thinking about how Access is doing that in relation to the task forces. What we found in our research, and it's important to be really clear about this, is not, these aren't issues that are happening in Renew, but we've asked people to talk about issues in their previous research where maybe collaboration might have failed or not gone that well. And the problems that people have talked about have been linked with research culture and research systems that are increasingly focused around competition, around kind of individual success, around future leaders. And these kinds of problems such as bullying or hierarchy, stealing ideas, not pulling weight, are potentially kind of people involved in interdisciplinary working might be more vulnerable to those kinds of issues. And also, you know, the research itself might be more vulnerable to that too. And yeah, as Angela said, you know, we've been thinking about elephants in the room, and these kinds of problems quite often tend to remain as elephants in the room. So it's been interesting that people have felt willing to talk with us in our research about some of these issues, and we're still thinking about why that might be, whether there's kind of a broader shift towards acknowledging those kind of problems, whether it's something methodological, we just don't know yet. Yeah, so interdisciplinarity in the past and in the present tends to involve disruptive creativity, and this kind of manifests in a range of different ways. So it might be about crossing boundaries, about flattening hierarchies, about caring and the kind of mundane practices of caring, tinkering with existing ways of doing things or thinking about things. So we have the kind of image there of the kind of stitching together the planet back together. Playing, so the importance of kind of creativity and having space to try things out, and scaffolding, which might be about kind of support from above rather than direction from above, but it could be also about kind of creating structures from below as well. So those are kind of some highlights of what we've been finding and thinking about in the research. And our next steps are obviously the next iteration of the practice guide, as I mentioned. We also have a report coming out that pulls together our kind of reflections on the work looking into the broader Changing the Environment programme and how interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary collaboration is kind of playing out there, and the sorts of challenges that and opportunities that are being encountered. We're doing some really exciting impact and engagement work, pulling together oral history clips from the Renew collection that we're building, and also from past National Life Stories collections, to think about environmental and agricultural communities and issues, and how these have traditionally been quite fragmented from each other, but also within each kind of field. So bringing those clips together to think about spanning some of those boundaries and taking those recordings to different spaces with different communities. And then in some point next year, we'll be organising a witness seminar, which is, for those of you not familiar with the methodology, and I have to admit I'm not super familiar with it, so I'm very excited about doing this. It's a kind of oral history focus group around a particular topic, and we're going to use that to think about biodiversity renewal and environmental collaboration in a kind of broader global context, because Renew tends to focus on the UK context. So I think I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for listening, and we're really excited to talk to you and kind of build connections between Renew and Access. And also thanks to Angela and our colleagues in the collaboration practice team. It's such a pleasure working together, and I'm excited to carry on. Thanks.
Sounds really, really exciting. I've got a question, but I'll see if there's anyone from the audience first. Anyone have a... Oh, there's a hand already. Two. Right, Stuart, go over it.
So I just wanted to find out a bit more about who the participants are in your oral histories, and who the participants will be in the kind of witness seminars. I've never heard of that term before, but that sounds really interesting. So just a bit more about who's engaging with the research.
So I mean, the oral history work, one of the things to say is originally we were only funded for kind of a year's worth of that work. And so it was very much about oral histories of biodiversity people, so it was very much kind of conservation focused. And so we had, as you can imagine, we can't be remotely comprehensive on that timescale. We're having to be very selective. We're working through the existing networks we have, the work that both us and the British Library people have done in the past, and using the Renew networks to go that way. But it's a real mix. So it's people, as I mentioned, who've kind of worked with policy a lot, or who are obviously themselves always worked across disciplines. We've been really fortunate in that we've gotten people involved in some of the very early citizen science projects, and we've also worked really hard on thinking about sort of diversity and representation in the work, so that it's not just kind of the great and the good, and particularly around conservation. That's really super important. So, for example, we've had oral histories with people from the Black Environment Network, and so on and so forth. So there's been, the first year was biodiversity, and then I think we galloped a bit too much earlier, and I didn't mention that we've gotten a very extra little pot from NERC, which has enabled us to kind of look at the other Changing the Environment projects, but also gave us another year. So we're now working on oral histories around environmental research more broadly, which has been fantastic, because it means we can start thinking about nuclear, energy, pollution, and I think the other thing that we've also managed to get is we've managed to get a number of significant figures who are social scientists, historians, who have been, again, working in this territory for a very long time. So that gives you some flavour. So it's not remotely comprehensive, and it's really important to stress that. You know, if a comprehensive piece of work like that would be taking a lot longer. A lot of these oral history projects tend to involve sort of 60 plus interviews, and I think we have each round is sort of, is it 5 long full life histories, which take 12 hours, 2 or 3 sessions, and I think it's about 20 or so short oral histories, which are sort of 3 to 4 hours. So that's give you some idea of what we're doing with that. The witness seminar. So witness seminars, as Alan described, you can kind of describe it as kind of like a focus group, but oral history. So the idea is that you gather together a group of people who have a shared past or worked on a specific problem or topic, who are at the end of their careers, and you get them basically to remember things together. And then you record this, the whole thing is on record, and you publish it as part of an archive. So in the past I've helped advise with a seminar on bovine TV, the history of bovine TV. Something that's really striking about these, certainly the one I was involved in, is that you can have people who were kind of completely at each other through the whole of their career, kind of sitting down and actually having quite a productive discussion around it, because the stakes are different, because it's about adding to the archival record. So the plan is to do one of those, as I say, to exactly when there's still a bit floating, but what we want to do is to focus particularly on international biodiversity policy, particularly because Renew is kind of UK focused, because it has to focus somehow, otherwise we just fly around forever. So that's where we're going with that.
Thank you.
I think Clive had a question.
So my voice will carry. So a lot of what you said about collaborations, I think, applies to systems approaches more generally. And a kind of side character of the way that we often approach systems problems is to say, okay, yes, we know we've got a system that's very complicated and complex, and so we'll break it down into its component parts, build collaborations around those and examine them in some detail, and then somehow forget to put the picture back together again. And I just wondered if that's something you've come across and be able to offer some insights to.
I don't know about insights, it's certainly something we're keeping a weather eye on. So, I mean, Eleanor flagged the scale issue, and it's really apparent in the Renew that each of the themes have developed their own, sometimes quite idiosyncratic way of collaborating. But then working across the themes is something that we're working quite actively on at the moment, because it's taken time for each team to sort of get itself going, and now it's, well, how do we connect up? And we do connect up via things like the Animal Biodiversity Parliament, and obviously with our partners and so on. But yeah, there's a scale issue, and something we're thinking about around the reinvention of the wheel is that we do wonder whether part of what's going on is that to do this work it's quite disruptive, and so it may be that partly what's needed is to open up temporary spaces that will collapse, but being conscious of that, and so preparing for the idea that whatever thing you're doing will come to an end. And so it's really important to take stock, connect things back together, and then think about how you pass on to whatever comes next. And that's partly why also archiving is a really important part of what we're doing in our theme.
Thank you. So just checking this. Gary, is there any online questions? Just okay. Do you want to carry on?
Yeah, thanks. Hi. Just wondering about whether you are or could look at the way the interdisciplinarity happened or didn't happen in the REF, because REF 21 was very explicitly attempting, had the ideal flag and all that kind of stuff. And it didn't really work.
We could. I don't think we've got capacity for that. I don't know if you have any thoughts. I think that would probably be a whole other project. I think that I have seen some papers that have started looking at this, but I don't know if you've got more thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's another project which would be fascinating, and I hope that we or somebody else can do it. Yeah, I don't really have many further thoughts. I mean, you know, it obviously comes up, people talk about REF and how that structures things, so yeah, we could maybe pull out findings that are specifically looking at how things are played out there. That's an exciting project, really good to do.
Further fun. Karen and then Nigel.
I suppose I was just reflecting on failure. I mean, you know, interdisciplinary. I mean, historically, you see different versions of it, and you know, it can be a label, and you still have. I mean, we talked about end of the pirate social sciences yesterday a little bit. So I guess is that part of your
Failure.
yeah.
Elephants.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so we did a first round of scoping interviews, and I think we managed to get reasonable. We didn't get everyone, we never will, but we did get a reasonable sample of people across the project. And one of the things we asked about, again, in terms of past experiences, was sort of what would success mean, and what would be a failure. I'm not sure we actually talked about it as failure, but we certainly talked about projects that haven't gone well. And so, for example, success, I think the overriding thing that came through is that a successful project is one where you continue working together, that it's not just about that project and the thing that you found, it's about the ongoing kind of braid of scholarship and investigation. But yeah, it's again what we're trying to capture.
Do you get a sense that changes over time? I mean, I guess with your history, you've got this temporal element that you're building into it. Do you get a sense that things evolve, or there are different problems?
I don't think we've figured that out yet. At the moment, we're mostly being focused on sort of pulling out commonalities, and there's a huge, you know, surprising number of commonalities that people are talking about, things that happened to them in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and it's very, very similar to the people that we're interviewing in Renew about things that happened in the 2000s. So, yeah, TBC, I think, but certainly getting people to talk about failure and importantly getting that into the evidence base, because we all know, you know, we do a project, we publish the good stuff, we talk about how wonderful it was, and we don't talk about the difficult things, and we don't talk about the elephants, and so that's kind of partly what we're trying to do empirically.
We've got last question, sorry, we need to wrap it up. Nigel?
Sure. Okay.
I think you were.
I was reflecting on your metaphor about reinventing the wheel. The contrary might well be that if you don't do research in this kind of area, well, that's a bad thing, and certainly the research councils are mindful of not leaving gaps, which would be the consequence of their work. And also kind of links into what you've just been saying about the importance of continuity in these things. So it might be that the problem is not reinventing the wheel, but rather something like not acknowledging that the wheel continues to turn.
Yeah, I think that is a good way of putting it, and it is partly why those quotes from Man and the Biosphere are just so incredibly striking. We did a session where we had some of the Changing the Environment team came into a session we were doing, and I showed them some of those, and they were kind of no idea. So it's partly reinvention, but it's also about amnesia and institutional memory, or lack of institutional memory, and thinking about the structural reasons why these things are not remembered. Yeah.
Thank you very much, it's fascinating, and I can see that there's lots more to talk about, so no, you're not going anywhere, so there'll be a coffee break later on, so everybody can jump on and ask more questions. So thank you very much for this fascinating sharing of your experiences, and hopefully
Thank you
we
for
can
inviting
further links. I'll invite you back maybe next year to share further ideas. So, thank you very much.
Thank you.